In 2002, the disappearance of a 14-year-old girl named Elizabeth Smart captured the attention of the United States. She was taken from her own home in the early hours of the morning and endured months under the control of her kidnappers. She was forced to change her identity and suffered various forms of abuse, but never lost hope of being rescued. This tragic case occurred in Salt Lake City, Utah, known as the Mormon capital of the world. Utah has the highest concentration of Mormons in North America. Before proceeding, since the Mormon religion will be mentioned in this episode, it is important to explain a little about the background of this religion. Like many other religions, the Mormon Church has different branches, some of which are considered more extreme. In the United States, contemporary Mormons typically refer to their church as LDS, an acronym for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In contrast, extremist groups seeking to revive practices like polygamy and live in isolated communities identify as FLDS, standing for the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is worth highlighting two things here. First, the FLDS groups are a minority, and unfortunately it was one of these followers who committed the crime narrated today. The second and most crucial thing, religion wasn't the motive for this crime. Let this be made very clear here, before there is a misunderstanding about it. Being polygamous and living in seclusion may be doctrines, and if consensual they cause no harm. However, kidnapping, coercion and threats reflect individual choices and not religious teachings. So, prepare yourself, not for the story portrayed in some movies or documentaries, but for the real and complete story of the kidnapping and rescue of Elizabeth Smart. In 1995, Ed and Lois Smart chose a spacious home in Salt Lake City, Utah, to raise their 5 children: William, Elizabeth, Edward, Mary Catherine, and Charles. At the time, Lois was pregnant with the 6th child, Andrew. Their new family home was located at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac and backed onto forested mountains, giving them a close connection to nature. Ed Smart worked as a financial consultant, while his wife, Lois, was a devoted homemaker. They were Mormons, part of a deeply rooted faith in the region, and actively participated in their local temple. The couple's children were also involved. 3 of them sang in the choir, and Elizabeth played the harp. The Smarts' lives were fairly ordinary and peaceful, but it was on the night of Tuesday, June 4th, 2002, that calm and security gave way to despair. It was the beginning of summer, and the kids were on their 2nd day of vacation. That morning, Lois took her children to the club to play sports, and later in the afternoon to an ice cream shop. At night, the family had dinner at home as usual, where they prayed together, and around 10 o'clock they all went to sleep. The older boys shared one room, the younger boys another, and Elizabeth shared a 3rd room with her younger sister, Mary Catherine. That night, lying in bed, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart felt as safe as anyone could imagine, until she was jolted awake by the press of a cold blade against her neck and the sound of a low, threatening whisper. "Don't make a sound, or I'll kill you. I'll kill your entire family. Now get up!" Elizabeth thought it was a nightmare, but she felt the man's rough beard touching her face, and the foul smell of his breath confirmed it was all very real. She obeyed his order. He led her to the bedroom bathroom, asked her to put on a pair of sneakers, and then walked slowly with him to the kitchen, all in absolute silence. The knife constantly pressed to her back. With silent tears, Elizabeth passed her parents' room without making a sound, leaving through the back door with her captor. Once outside, the man with a thick beard led her toward the mountains. About 100 meters from her house, he retrieved a backpack hidden in the bushes. Under the moonlight, Elizabeth recognized him. It was the man who had repaired their roof weeks before. He confirmed her fear by answering, "Yes, it's me, Emmanuel. But now you're going up the mountain with me, and I don't want to hear another word until we get to the top. If you run, I'll catch you. If you scream, I'll kill you, and then I'll kill your whole family. If you want their good, do everything I tell you." They spent hours ascending the mountain. They crossed a dense forest, sometimes crawling under branches and through the dark, unfamiliar terrain. Emmanuel deliberately chose a rugged, pathless route to avoid leaving traces. Elizabeth cried silently, shivering with fear, praying silently to God that someone would appear to rescue her. But as they climbed further into the night, her hope of being found began to fade. Back at the house, no one noticed the abduction, except for Elizabeth's 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine. She had heard everything, but remained motionless under the covers, terrified of the man with the knife. Paralyzed by shock, she remained motionless under the covers. Only hours later did she find the strength to get up and tell her parents what she had witnessed. Ed and Lois initially thought their daughter had a nightmare, but when they reached the girl's room, they saw that Elizabeth was missing. Panic set in as they searched every corner of the house to no avail. At the kitchen window, they noticed the insect screen had been sliced open, a sight that sent them into immediate distress. They dialed 911, crying out for help as they begged for police assistance. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was already at the top of the mountain with her kidnapper. The climb had taken hours, leaving her exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified. She then saw a crude encampment, a huge hole in the ground covered with a tent made of wood and canvas. This place, despite being in dense forest and high on the mountain, was only 4.5 kilometers from his house. Moments later, a woman with grey hair emerged from the tent, looking older than Emmanuel, and wearing only a simple white linen robe. This was Bazi, his wife. They quickly began a wedding ceremony, with Elizabeth as Emmanuel's intended new wife. All she could do was cry and pray. Emmanuel and Bazi's so-called home, the small shabby tent, had no water or electricity, just a basic structure barely the size of a double bed. They kept 3 buckets to collect water and a basket with a few pieces of fruit and cookies. Sanitation was non-existent. A few minutes later, Emmanuel ordered Elizabeth to remove her pajamas and put on a white robe like Bazi's. Crying, she obeyed. Emmanuel then spoke aloud to the heavens, muttering various words, and after that, amidst screams of desperation, she was dragged against her will into that hole in the tent. Back at Elizabeth's home, a team of 6 officers gathered evidence and interviewed her parents. As the word spread, neighbours grew curious, and soon the scene outside became chaotic. Mary Catherine, Elizabeth's younger sister, was the only witness to the intruder, but having pretended to be asleep, she couldn't provide much detail. She only remembered that the man was thin from the silhouette under the covers and that he smelled terrible. By 8 a.m., the police had already started the search, and many relatives, friends and neighbours mobilised to help. Local TV channels alerted the community to keep an eye out for a girl measuring approximately 5 feet tall, 14 years old, blonde with blue eyes who was possibly accompanied by a man. Salt Lake City police, firefighters and the FBI set up a task force, heightening the family's worry, as an FBI agent explained that if she wasn't found within 48 hours, the chances of finding her would drop to below 20%. Hours later, Elizabeth, who ended up sleeping on the floor of the tent, was still tied up and now physically and emotionally scarred, if you know what I mean, heard a voice coming from a distance. Due to all the trauma, she thought she was delusional, but she hears it again much. The voice got closer and closer. As the voice drew nearer, she realized it was her uncle calling for her. Before she could respond, Emmanuel pressed the knife to her neck and warned, "If you make a sound, I'll cut off your head right here. Then I'll go to your house and do the same to your family." Terrified, Elizabeth stayed silent, listening as her uncle's voice grew fainter. Minutes later, when it was safe for Emmanuel to speak louder again, he reprimanded her. He said that if someone appears again calling her name, she should ignore it, as she was no longer Elizabeth. She was now Shir Yashab Isaiah. Elizabeth said she didn't want that name because she didn't know what it meant, and asked if she could choose her own name. Emmanuel authorized her to choose a second name. She then chose Esther, which is a biblical name, and she believed that somehow she would be closer to the hope of being rescued. She was now Shir Yashab Esther Isaiah. Unfortunately, that night was just the beginning of countless nights of abuse. Often, the assaults happened more than once a day. Helicopters flew over the region, but the search weakened as time went by. Days after the kidnapping, without news of his daughter and imagining the worst things in the world, Ed Smart had a nervous breakdown and was rushed to the hospital. Before long, the water in the tent ran out and Emmanuel had to go down the mountain. In fact, for weeks Elizabeth had only taken one bath, this bath being a gallon of water thrown quickly over her head. Emmanuel then went to the city alone to get water, and it took him practically all day. When he returned, he brought back leaflets with Elizabeth's face on them, and taunting her, he said, "It seems the whole city is looking for you, but don't get excited. You will be here for a long time, long enough for everyone to believe you died and forget you exist." Meanwhile, the police were zeroing in on a suspect, Richard Albert Ricci. Richard had done bricklaying work at the Smarts' house, and two pieces of evidence pointed out to him. First, he had rented a car just 5 days before Elizabeth's disappearance, returning it the day after with over 1,500 kilometers on the odometer. Second, a neighbor reported seeing him digging a hole near his house. Despite Richard and his wife, Angela, insisting they had no involvement, he was wrongfully arrested. A month passed, and the 4th of July holiday arrived. To celebrate the date, Emmanuel took 2 bottles of wine from his backpack, declaring that everyone would drink. Elizabeth resisted, reminding him that she was underage, but he threatened her, saying that if she refused, she wouldn't get any food. As she was very hungry, she ended up taking a few sips. Upon seeing her disgusted reaction to the drink, Emmanuel was irritated and forced her to drink the entire bottle. With great difficulty, she drank it all, and it didn't take long for her to black out, unconscious for the rest of the night. She had no idea what happened while she was out, but the injuries she discovered in the morning hinted at the cruelty she had endured. The tent routine was pretty much the same every day. Emmanuel and Bazi would wake up around 5:30 in the morning, wake Elizabeth up, eat cookies or fruit, and Emmanuel would begin his daily preaching. He claimed to be a prophet, chosen by God to restore fundamentalist practices and correct Mormon doctrine. He complained about the terrible burden of being a prophet, but he had to hold on because that was the Lord's calling. God had appointed him to revolutionize the times and instructed him to obtain 7 wives. According to him, these wives had to be Mormons, virgins, pure, and he would need to descend them so that later God could kindle them. And what Emmanuel meant by descending them was taking them to the lowest possible level of the human condition, taking away everything from them, so that in the ascension they could win, be reborn in the true purity of a new life. One day, after another of his preachings, Emmanuel made a chilling announcement. God had told him it was time to take a new wife. He revealed his next target, Olivia, Elizabeth's cousin, who was her age and also lived in Salt Lake City. It was a reckless plan, especially with the whole city on high alert. Choosing someone so close to Elizabeth, in the same neighborhood, from the same family, bordered on absurdity. Terrified, Elizabeth begged him not to do it, but Barzy scolded her. That night, Emmanuel changed into pants and a t-shirt, the same clothes he wore when he had kidnapped her, and set out to the city. Emmanuel circled Olivia's house and tried to open the doors, but they were all locked until he found an unlocked kitchen window. He cut the insect screen to enter the house, but knocked over a vase in the process. Thinking he'd woken someone, he fled into the nearby woods and returned to the camp without Olivia. The next morning, Olivia's father discovered the broken vase, cut screen, and a chair beneath the window. When he reported it to the police, they dismissed his concerns, calling it a prank. They were convinced Elizabeth's kidnapper was Richard Ricci, who was in jail awaiting charges, and admitting another attempted abduction might imply they had arrested the wrong man. Speaking of Richard, a tragic turn of events happened to him. Under the immense stress of his imprisonment, he suffered a fatal stroke on August 30th. His death complicated the case further, as the police believed he'd taken the secret of Elizabeth's whereabouts to the grave. Desperate, they announced a $20,000 reward for information leading to Elizabeth's remains. Ed Smart, Elizabeth's father, felt immense guilt over Richard's death, unsure he was the true culprit. The evidence was weak, and he sensed the police were more focused on convicting Richard than on searching for his daughter. After the summer, the temperature in Utah began to get cold, and Emmanuel realized that they would not be able to survive in the tent, as the temperature on the mountain at night during the winter could vary from -5 degrees to -15 degrees Celsius, not to mention that the mountain would be covered in snow. One morning, he announced that God had instructed him to lead them into Salt Lake City to find shelter under bridges. In retrospect, it's clear that Emmanuel's divine revelations were often just whims disguised as prophecy. To ensure Elizabeth wasn't recognized, Barzy gave her a scarf to cover her hair and a veil that hid her face from the nose down, leaving only her eyes visible. She crafted a similar veil for herself, and the 3 of them descended into the city carrying empty backpacks and buckets. On the streets, everyone begged for alms, with Elizabeth always holding hands with Barzy. Barzy held her hand very tightly and forbade her to make eye contact with people on the street. She had to always look down. At that time, one no longer saw so many posters on the streets, nor groups of people looking for them. As Salt Lake City is a city with many religious branches, and some groups are very eclectic, few people paid attention to the unusual family, as they were accustomed to seeing various religious groups in the region. Any money they gathered went to buying alcohol. Emmanuel and Barzy drank heavily, often leaving nothing for food. They scavenged from trash bins, and Elizabeth, remembering how her mother had taught her and her siblings not to waste food, found herself desperately hoping to find scraps. Occasionally, passers-by would give them water or something to eat, but this was rare. One night, Emmanuel decided they should attend a party. Elizabeth hoped someone there might recognize her. However, upon arriving, she saw that everyone was intoxicated or on drugs. In that state, there was little chance anyone would recognize a girl hidden under a veil. Photos from that night later surfaced online, showing Emmanuel forcing her to drink and try drugs. She genuinely believed she might die that night. Days later, Emmanuel and Bazi decided to visit a public library to beg students for alms. A student who bought them a snack couldn't help but stare at Elizabeth, looking into her eyes with strange curiosity. Likely suspecting something, he may have called the police. Because minutes later, 2 officers approached their table. The officers asked Emmanuel if they could see the girl's face. Under the table, Bazi pulled a pocket knife from her sock, pressing it against Elizabeth's leg, a silent reminder of the consequences if she said anything. Emmanuel responded saying, "No one outside my family is allowed to see her face. If you want to see it, you'd have to marry her. She'd become yours, and only then would you have that right." Faced with this bizarre reply, the officers left. The next morning, Emmanuel awoke with yet another revelation. God now wanted them to move to California. Likely, Emmanuel was feeling the cold, along with a rising fear that the police might return and he would lose control. Conveniently, money for the tickets appeared miraculously, actually the result of a grocery store robbery. And so, they fled from Salt Lake City, Utah to San Diego, California. In the last week of November, during the Thanksgiving holiday, people set up meal tents to serve the homeless. That was the first time in almost 6 months that Elizabeth had eaten a plate of real food, a hot meal. She recalls that it was one of the most delicious foods she had ever tried in her entire life. A few days later, Emmanuel visited the San Diego Mormon temple and returned with a new revelation. His next wife would be from this city. He devised a plan, left that night, but returned alone, visibly angry. That night, Elizabeth endured yet another traumatic ordeal, similar to many others, though not all are recounted here. Three weeks earlier, on Elizabeth's birthday, November 3rd, her sister Mary Catherine went to sleep, praying as she did every night that they would find Elizabeth. When she awoke, she told her parents she had a dream, in which she recognized the voice of her sister's kidnapper. She remembered it was Emmanuel, the man who had repaired their roof shortly before the abduction. They called the police and said that Mary had finally recognized the kidnapper's voice, but the police believed that the family was doing that so that the police could resume their search for Elizabeth and take the focus away from Richard, who, poor thing, passed away innocently in prison. While the police focused their operations on finding Elizabeth's body, Ed and Lois Smart decided to act on Mary's intuition. They hired an artist to sketch Emmanuel's face and managed to have it aired on the national television show America's Most Wanted. The broadcast triggered numerous calls, especially from Salt Lake City. Many recognized the man as Brian David Mitchell, a drifter who claimed to be a prophet and often preached fundamentalist ideas on city streets. Among the callers were Mitchell's stepson and his own son, both estranged from him. They not only identified him but also expressed concern, knowing he was capable of theft, kidnapping, and potentially worse. With these new leads, the police now had strong connections that couldn't be ignored. A manhunt for Emmanuel, now identified as Brian Mitchell, began. But before we delve into Elizabeth's incredible rescue, it's essential to understand Mitchell's disturbing background to gain insight into his twisted mind. Brian David Mitchell was born in 1953, one of 5 siblings. His mother was a teacher and his father was a social worker. The family were Mormons, not fundamentalists, and they were a very decent family and were respected in the community. His siblings described their parents as loving, dedicated, without any type of domestic violence. From a young age, however, Brian showed troubling behaviour, frequently getting into fights and encountering problems both at school and on the streets. At 19, his girlfriend became pregnant, and they married, eventually having a second child before separating. Years later, he met his second wife, Debbie, who already had 2 children, and together they had 2 more. At age 27, Brian met one of his siblings who had returned from a mission for the Mormon Church. During the mission, this brother visited many places, and Brian was jealous that his brother was having these opportunities, and he wasn't. So he began studying the scriptures. He also read a lot about Satanism, and from there, he started to mix the information and follow a fundamentalist line of preaching. Debbie grew concerned about his increasingly radical ideas, but Brian dismissed her concerns, claiming that knowing evil was necessary to combat it. Gradually, Brian's behaviour became abusive and violent. Debbie once suspected he had harmed their youngest child, a toddler at the time, and reported him to the authorities. The case was dismissed, but Debbie filed for divorce and left with her 4 children. After Debbie, Brian meets his third wife, Wanda Eileen Barzy, a 40-year-old woman who had abandoned her 6 children to be with him. Together, Brian and Barzy began their own church. He grew a beard and took on the name Emmanuel. At first, a few people attended his services, but as his sermons increasingly centered on Satan, his followers grew fearful and stopped coming. Isolated, without income or support, Brian and Barzy eventually found themselves living on the streets. One day they were begging when a woman with 2 daughters and a baby approached. They were Lois, Elizabeth, Mary Catherine, and baby Andrew. The girls asked their mother to help that poor man with some coins. Lois found what she had in her bag, gave it to Brian and left. As she walked away, Elizabeth tells her mother how sad it is to see people in that situation. In pure innocence, she said something like, "Poor guy, if he could only work, he wouldn't need to be on the street." Moved, Lois returns and asks the man if he knew how to do general maintenance work. He said, yes. She then gave him a piece of paper with her phone number on it, and within a week, at age 49, Brian was repairing the roof of the Smarts house, introducing himself as Emmanuel. On March 12, 2003, 9 months after Elizabeth's abduction, Brian, dissatisfied with life in San Diego and unaware that his face had been broadcast nationwide, decided to return to Salt Lake City. Believing the search for Elizabeth had faded, he prepared for the journey. For the first time, Elizabeth made a suggestion. She proposed they hitchhike instead of taking the bus. Brian agreed, thinking this would spare them time spent begging and prevent the need for another robbery. Her real intent was to be seen by someone and rescued, but to prevent her from drawing attention, Brian covered her entire head with a hood. They travelled from ride to ride, stopping at gas stations and intersections whenever a driver had to divert from the Salt Lake City route. At one stop, as they were seeking their next ride, a police car approached and recognized Brian and pulled over to question them. At that moment, Barzy, who was holding hands with Elizabeth, squeezed the girl's hand so hard that she dug her nails into her skin. As the police officer goes to the car, she whispers in Elizabeth's ear, "You can take off your hood, but don't forget that if you say anything wrong, we will kill your entire family." Elizabeth, scared to death, took off her hood, leaving only her eyes visible, but kept her gaze downcast the entire time. Noticing the exchange between Barzy and Elizabeth, one officer discreetly alerted his partner. Returning his attention to Elizabeth, he asked, "What's your name?" Elizabeth replied, "Shir Yashab Esther Isaiah." The police officer then moved her away from the two in order to untie her hand with Barzi's, brings the girl about 3 meters away from them. He knelt down, and even with Elizabeth looking at the ground the whole time, he tells her what she needs to hear. "We're looking for a girl who disappeared 9 months ago, and her family is desperate. They have been praying every day that she will be found. Not a day goes by that they aren't waiting for us, to knock on their door to say we found her. Now please tell me, what's your name?" Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face, answering before she could speak. Yet the officer gently insisted, "No one here will hurt you. We're here to help. Just tell me your name." Finally, she replied, "Elizabeth." When he asked her full name, she confirmed, "Elizabeth Ann Smart." The officers immediately arrested Brian and Barzy, calling for reinforcements to avoid transporting them in the same vehicle as Elizabeth. As she was freed from her captors and that oppressive robe, Elizabeth broke down in tears of relief. She underwent a forensic examination, revealing painful evidence of her ordeal. She was thin, pale, unwashed, and scarred both physically and psychologically. Her father was notified of the rescue, and in despair and afraid of it being a mistake, and not wanting to give false hope to his wife, he went to the police station alone. Elizabeth later described that this was one of the happiest and most indescribable moments of her entire life. However, her father Ed later said in an interview that it was the strangest moment he had ever experienced. For her, that was her father, the same one she hugged, asked for blessings, and said goodnight hours before she was kidnapped on June 4th, 2002. But to him, that girl, in that state, didn't physically look like the daughter he had tucked into bed. It was only after hearing Elizabeth calling him Dad that his heart broke into 1,000 pieces. Minutes later, he informed his wife and all family members that his daughter was safe and sound. In the years that followed, Elizabeth found strength and healing through her family and her love for music. She completed high school, went to college, and majored in music. The trial for Brian and Barzy didn't begin until November 2010, nearly 8 years after the kidnapping. Brian David Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison for kidnapping, torture, physical abuse, and false imprisonment. Wanda Barzy received 15 years for her role as an accessory to kidnapping and false imprisonment, with no chance of parole. Because Barzy had already served prison time since 2003, she was initially scheduled for release in 2018, but due to good behaviour, her release was moved up to a year before. She became free in 2017, continued to live in Salt Lake City in social support homes, and her own children, those she had previously abandoned, never visited her in prison and insist on not having any contact with her. Brian is still serving his life sentence in a maximum security federal prison in Tucson, Arizona. Tragically, Richard Ricci, the man wrongly accused and who died in prison, left behind his devastated wife, Angela, who struggled to accept his death due to police error. Though the state awarded her $150,000 in compensation, she struggled with addiction and in 2015 was found deceased in her Utah apartment due to a drug overdose. Elizabeth spent her remaining teenage years secluded with her family. After reaching adulthood, and with years of psychological support, she emerged as a resilient woman dedicated to helping others. In 2011, she founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, which actively fights against sexual violence through educational projects and programs, including self-defense courses. In 2012, she married Matthew Gilmore, a boy she met in 2009 during a church mission trip. Today they have 3 children, Chloe, James, and Olivia. In her interviews, we can see how mature she is regarding the subject. She is not afraid or ashamed to speak out, because she knows that this space given to her today is the opportunity that many families can have to prevent themselves from risky situations. She reminds everyone that this can happen to anyone, just like it happened to her, who was safe, or thought she was, inside her own home. Elizabeth's story has been told through several books, with 3 of the most popular being In Plain Sight, 2006, written by Elizabeth's uncle, Thomas Smart, and 2 books written by Elizabeth herself, My Story, 2014, and Where There's Hope, 2018. The Elizabeth Smart case is a story of courage and resilience that deserves to be shared. What do you think of the sentences given to the perpetrators? Life for Brian and 15 years for Barzy. Would you have had the strength and perseverance that Elizabeth displayed? Leave your opinion in the comments, and I'll see you in the next case.